Millionaire thought he married an ugly woman, but his wedding night left him shocked. A millionaire groom lifts his bride's veil, and what he sees leaves him utterly speechless. But this isn't just a wedding. It's the beginning of a dangerous game of secrets, power, and a love he never saw coming. A grand ballroom, chandeliers casting golden light. David Whitman stands before his veiled bride, Anna. His hand trembles slightly as he reaches for the fabric, only for her to step back, stopping him. A hushed gasp ripples through the crowd. Why is she hiding? What is she afraid of? And when the truth is finally revealed, will it be too late? A marriage built on mystery, a love tested by betrayal, and a past that refuses to stay buried. Stay till the end, because this story is not what you think, it's even bigger. David Whitman, a billionaire who built his empire on control, is forced into an arranged marriage with Anna, a woman he's never seen. On their wedding night, she refuses to remove her veil, igniting a scandal that shakes high society. But Anna isn't just hiding her face, she's hiding a past that could destroy them both. As David's frustration turns into obsession, he digs deeper into her secrets, only to uncover a truth that changes everything. Powerful enemies emerge, a war from the past resurfaces, and David finds himself standing at a crossroads. Protect the woman he was forced to marry, or expose the truth that could cost them both their lives. Because sometimes, love isn't about what you see, it's about what you're willing to fight for. Stay tuned. This is more than just a wedding night. It's the beginning of an unforgettable love story. Hello everyone. I'm the narrator. Today, I bring you a millionaire love story. A love that rises above all challenges. Where hearts find each other in a world of luxury. True wealth isn't just money. It's love that lasts. Do you believe in destined love? If so, like, share, comment, and subscribe to Millionaire Love Stories for more heart-touching stories. Now, let's step into this story together. Love is not about possession, it's about appreciation. David Whitman, a young billionaire with a string of successful ventures and a reputation for getting exactly what he wanted, never expected his life to take such a surprising turn. A man used to having the upper hand, David thrived in his world of high-powered business deals, private jets, and the kind of luxury that made others envious. But beneath the polished surface, he harbored a deep resentment toward the traditional structures and obligations imposed by his influential family. In their eyes, his success wasn't enough. He needed to secure the legacy of the Whitman name by entering into a carefully arranged marriage. To David, this was nothing short of a betrayal of his independence, and he had no intention of being coerced into a union he didn't want. The bride, Anna Whitman, was no ordinary match, hailing from a similarly powerful family. She was known for her intellect, poise, and, curiously, her mysterious veil. From the moment David met her, she was shrouded, literally and figuratively, in layers of enigma. At their wedding, David's carefully controlled demeanor faltered when he saw his bride for the first time. Her face was hidden behind a delicate but concealing veil, leaving only her steady, composed voice to fill the void. As he reached out to lift the fabric and fulfill the expected ceremonial gesture, Anna took a step back. "Why won't you let me see you?" David's tone was sharp, frustration cutting through his otherwise polished manner. Anna's response was calm, yet firm. "Because I need you to see who I am first, beyond what I look like." Those words unsettled David in a way he hadn't anticipated. He didn't believe in romanticized notions of love or soulmates. For him, relationships were built on mutual benefit, shared goals, and, yes, appearance. He wanted his wife to look the part, to complement his polished image and reinforce his standing among his peers. But now, this woman, his wife, was asking something he'd never considered before. She was asking him to look beyond the surface, to search for something deeper. The reception that followed only heightened David's discomfort. Every whispered comment from guests and every curious glance directed at Anna's veil chipped away at his patience. He heard murmurs questioning her appearance. Was she hiding scars? Was she disfigured? Had she lured him into this arrangement under false pretenses? Each rumor, each insinuation, fueled his irritation. He began to see her as a problem to be solved rather than a partner. But Anna didn't waver. As the weeks turned into months, David found himself increasingly challenged by her composed demeanor. She didn't beg for his approval or crumble under the weight of society's judgments. Instead, she carried herself with a quiet strength that defied his expectations. And while he continued to insist she remove the veil, her steady refusals forced him to confront a part of himself he wasn't ready to face. "I don't understand you," he said one evening, his voice tinged with exasperation. "You say you want me to know you, yet you keep yourself hidden." Anna met his gaze, or what she could see of it through the veil, and answered simply, "I want you to know me for the person I am, not the image you expect." Her words stayed with him, replaying in his mind long after she had left the room. David was a man who thrived on control, who valued certainty and clarity. But Anna's approach, her insistence on being understood before being seen, made him question everything he thought he knew about connection. In a world where beauty was currency and appearances were the foundation of status, Anna's challenge was as perplexing as it was compelling. Slowly, David found himself observing her more closely, not to catch a glimpse of the face she refused to reveal, but to understand her actions, her decisions, her character. He watched as she handled household matters with grace, treated staff with kindness, and offered insights that left him, for the first time, reconsidering his own rigid perspectives. And though he didn't admit it, even to himself, he was beginning to see Anna, not her face, but something far deeper, something he couldn't yet articulate. Each passing day added a layer of complexity to his feelings, leaving him unsure of where this path would lead. But one thing was clear: his initial disdain was giving way to a hesitant respect, a reluctant curiosity that might just be the beginning of something he never thought possible. Session 1. An unwanted marriage. David Whitman stood at the edge of the grand ballroom, his fingers tightening around a crystal tumbler of bourbon. The walls shimmered with golden light, reflected off crystal chandeliers and gilded mirrors. Guests moved in swirling clusters, all smiles, their laughter punctuating the soft strains of a string quartet. It was, by all appearances, a perfect wedding reception, yet David felt no joy, no pride, no happiness. His eyes darted toward the raised dais at the center of the room, where his bride sat composed and regal, her face hidden behind a veil of thick, opaque silk. Anna Whitman, his wife, though the word left a bitter taste in his mouth. She was the daughter of a powerful industrialist, chosen for him by his father's advisors to seal a critical business alliance. A strategic marriage, they'd called it, vital for the future of Whitman Enterprises. David hadn't agreed, hadn't wanted any part of it. He'd fought tooth and nail to avoid standing here tonight. But his father's warnings, the company's financial pressures, and the mounting familial expectations had been impossible to escape. The first time David had laid eyes on Anna had been at the ceremony. He'd lifted the delicate veil that morning expecting to meet the woman who would, on paper, become his partner in life. Instead, he'd been confronted by a second veil, this one thicker, concealing her entire face. She had refused to remove it, even after he had asked, no, demanded, that she do so. "You'll see my face when it matters," she had said, her voice steady and calm. The words still grated on him. When it matters, what did that even mean? It mattered now. He'd married her, hadn't he? Yet the moment she'd spoken those words, she had turned and walked down the aisle, leaving David dumbfounded in her wake. Even as the ceremony continued, the oddity of her refusal drew murmurs among the guests. By the time the vows were exchanged, the whispers had grown into a cacophony of speculation. "Is she disfigured?" one woman whispered to her companion, her fan fluttering as she leaned in closer. "Perhaps she's hiding something scandalous," another added, her voice laced with faux concern. David had heard it all. He could feel their eyes on him now, stealing glances and trying to decipher his mood. How was he supposed to look? He'd just entered a sham of a marriage. And now his bride, the one person who might have had some shred of sympathy for his predicament, seemed to be toying with him, cloaked in mystery and veils. Every forced smile he offered, every nod to a well-wisher, felt like another blow to his pride. He was the golden boy of the Whitman family, a young millionaire who had built his company's tech division into a global powerhouse. Yet here he was, a laughingstock on his wedding day. David's scowl deepened as he tossed back the bourbon, the liquid burning down his throat. He turned away from the crowd, making his way toward a quiet corner of the room. His head throbbed, and the oppressive weight of the evening seemed to double with every step. "Mr. Whitman," a voice interrupted. It was one of his father's longtime associates. A gray-haired man with a permanent smirk and a handshake that squeezed just a little too hard. "You've outdone yourself. The reception is truly magnificent." David forced a tight-lipped smile. "Glad you're enjoying it. And your lovely wife, such poise. Such elegance. A perfect match for a man of your stature." David's smile faltered. He wanted to tell the man to shove off. To stop pretending this was some grand fairy tale when it was anything but. But instead, he nodded. "Thank you." The man drifted back into the crowd. And David released a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He made his way to the balcony. Stepping outside into the cool night air, the city lights sprawled before him, glittering like a million tiny diamonds against the dark velvet sky. He rested his hands on the marble railing, letting the crisp air cut through the heat of his frustration. In the distance, the faint hum of the reception continued, voices mingling with the soft strains of music. But out here, David could think, and all he could think about was her. Anna. The name itself was simple, unassuming, and she'd been perfectly composed during the ceremony, her posture straight, her words clear, her voice calm, yet she had been an enigma, shrouded in that veil and wrapped in layers of secrecy. Every time he tried to recall her face, all he could see was the blank, featureless silk. Why was she hiding? What was she hiding? A gust of wind ruffled his dark hair, carrying with it a hint of her perfume. He hadn't noticed it earlier in the chaos of the ceremony, but now the subtle floral scent lingered in his mind, pulling at something he couldn't quite define. It was infuriating, this hold she had on his thoughts. He'd never even seen her, yet here he was, consumed by her presence, or rather, her lack of presence. As he leaned over the railing, the sound of the door opening behind him drew his attention. David turned to see her, standing in the doorway. The veil was still in place, her silhouette outlined by the warm glow of the ballroom behind her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You're avoiding me," she said softly. David straightened, his expression hardening. "Can you blame me? You won't even show me who I married." Anna stepped closer, the gentle click of her heels on the marble floor cutting through the silence. "Is that all that matters to you?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. "A face?" David's jaw tightened. "It's not just about a face. It's about trust. It's about honesty. How am I supposed to trust someone who hides behind a mask?" She stopped a few paces away, her posture steady, her hands resting lightly in front of her. "You'll see my face, David, when it matters." He threw his hands up, frustration boiling over. "When it matters? That's what you said before. What does that even mean?" Anna tilted her head slightly, as if weighing her next words. "It means I need to know who you really are before I show you who I really am." David stared at her, the anger in his chest mingling with confusion. He had expected defiance, perhaps even fear, but Anna seemed utterly unshaken. It was maddening. He wanted to lash out, to demand answers, but something about the way she stood there, calm, unyielding, made him pause. "Why?" he asked, his voice quieter now. "Why are you doing this?" Anna took a step closer. "Because I need to know that you see me for more than just what's on the surface. I need to know that you're willing to look deeper." He shook his head, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "That's a hell of a way to start a marriage." "Maybe," she said, her tone unwavering, "but it's the only way I know." David let out a long breath, running a hand through his hair. "You're asking for a lot. And so are you," she replied. "You're asking me to trust you, to share everything with you. That's not something I can do blindly." He turned back toward the city lights, his mind spinning. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "Neither do I," Anna said, "but maybe we can figure it out together." The quiet sincerity in her words caught him off guard. He glanced back at her, the tension in his shoulders easing ever so slightly. Maybe, he thought, maybe there was a way forward. But it wouldn't be easy. And it wouldn't be simple. As the night stretched on, the sounds of the reception fading into the distance, David and Anna stood together on that balcony. Two strangers bound by circumstance and a tenuous hope that somehow, against all odds, they could find their way. Session 2. Gossip and Social Pressure. As news of David and Anna's unusual marriage began to spread, it didn't take long for whispers to echo through high society circles. David, one of the most eligible bachelors in the city, had been pressured into marrying Anna Whitman, a woman whose face no one could describe. The gossip turned into a flood of rumors. She must be hiding some kind of disfigurement. Some said, "A shame for a man like David to be tied to someone he can't even introduce properly." Others murmured. David first became aware of the chatter at a dinner hosted by an old family friend. As he entered the opulent hall, heads turned, and conversations abruptly stopped. He caught fragments of the whispers. "That's him. The one with the mystery wife." He clenched his jaw and pressed forward, pretending not to notice. That evening, Anna chose not to attend. She had long ago accepted that her decision to keep her face hidden would spark curiosity. She wore the veil not out of shame, but as a shield, proof that she wanted to be seen for her character and mind, not her appearance. In her quiet defiance, she found strength, but she also knew the toll it was taking on David. While she was prepared to endure the judgment, she wondered if he was. At the dinner, David found himself cornered by well-meaning acquaintances. "David, old friend," a wealthy industrialist said, his tone light but cutting. "We've all been wondering when we'll get to meet your wife without the veil." "I assure you," David replied coldly, "Anna's not hiding anything she should be ashamed of." "But then why the secrecy?" another woman asked, her eyes narrowing with curiosity. Surely she could at least attend more public events. People are starting to talk. David's patience frayed. "Anna values her privacy," he said firmly. "And frankly, it's none of your business." He left the conversation with a growing tension in his chest. Though he hadn't allowed himself to say it aloud, he couldn't help but feel irritated by Anna's refusal to remove the veil. It had created a social barrier, one he didn't know how to navigate. He prided himself on his reputation, on the respect he commanded in every room. But now, his peers looked at him differently, some with pity, others with barely concealed amusement. David's marriage had become a spectacle, and he loathed it. Back at the house, Anna was reading in the parlor when David returned. His shoulders tense, she set down her book, immediately sensing his mood. "How was the dinner?" "Fine," he said curtly, shrugging off his coat, "though I think you already know what everyone was talking about." Anna closed her book gently and met his gaze. "I can imagine." "Then you can imagine how exhausting it is to have to defend you at every turn," David said, his voice sharp. "People think you're hiding some horrible disfigurement, that I'm some kind of fool for agreeing to this marriage." Anna took a steadying breath. "I never asked you to defend me, David. I only asked that you give me time." "Time for what, Anna?" His frustration spilled over. "What exactly are we waiting for? You're my wife. You're supposed to stand by me, not hide behind a veil and leave me to face the questions alone." Her expression remained calm, but her voice carried a firm edge. "I stand by you every day, David. I run this household. I ensure the staff are cared for. And I've offered my help with your work whenever you've let me. I'm not hiding from my responsibilities. I'm simply asking that you see me for who I am, not just what I look like." David fell silent, his anger dissipating as quickly as it had come. He felt a flicker of guilt, but it was buried under his growing resentment of their situation. "This isn't how marriage is supposed to work," he muttered. Anna rose from her seat, her back straight. "Marriage is supposed to be a partnership. David, I'm trying to be your partner, but I won't apologize for wanting to be understood on my terms. If that's too much to ask, then maybe it's not me you're angry at, maybe it's the idea that you can't control this." Her words struck a nerve. David said nothing as Anna quietly left the room. He poured himself a drink and stared into the glass, feeling the weight of her statement. Control. It was true. He was used to being in control of every aspect of his life. Yet here was Anna, defying the expectations he had carried since their marriage began. She was an enigma, one he wasn't sure he had the patience to unravel. Session 3. Surprising Discoveries. Time began to pass in the Whitman household. Days bled into weeks, and the initial storm of anger that defined David's early interactions with Anna started to subside. He found himself reluctantly paying closer attention to her, not to her shrouded face, but to her actions, her mannerisms, and the way she moved through their shared world. What he discovered surprised him. Anna had a quiet strength. Despite the tension between them and the critical gaze of society, she maintained a grace that was impossible to ignore. She didn't hide away, nor did she seem to flinch at the whispers and stares that followed her wherever they went. When David overheard her conversing with the household staff, offering encouragement to the housekeeper, lending a compassionate ear to the driver's family troubles, he saw a side of her that was far removed from the disdain he had carried for their arranged union. On one particular morning, David returned home earlier than usual from a business meeting. He had intended to retrieve some files and head back out, but he paused in the hallway when he heard voices coming from the library. To his surprise, it was Anna's voice, calm and measured, as she spoke to a junior consultant from his company. Intrigued, he moved closer. "I believe the data from the preliminary report doesn't account for market fluctuations," Anna said, pointing at the papers spread out before her. "If you recalculate with this baseline, you might find that your projections hold more weight. It's not just about the numbers, it's about timing the strategy correctly. I'm no expert, but I've seen my father deal with similar patterns in his own businesses." David couldn't believe what he was hearing. She was discussing business, not just idly, but with a level of insight that suggested she had been observing his operations more closely than he'd imagined. The consultant nodded thoughtfully, scribbling notes as Anna patiently answered his questions. When the conversation ended and the young man left, David stood frozen. Who was this woman who had effortlessly stepped into a discussion he assumed was beyond her scope? When Anna emerged from the library and saw David standing there, she paused. Her hands moved instinctively to adjust the scarf covering her face, as though preparing for another round of his criticism. But David didn't say anything. Not yet. Instead, he simply watched her walk past him, her steps as measured and composed as ever. Later that evening, David couldn't get the scene out of his mind. He found himself sitting in his study, a drink in hand, going over the conversation he'd overheard. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that Anna wasn't the woman he had assumed her to be. She wasn't weak or naive. She wasn't hiding out of fear. She had stepped into his world and, in her quiet way, had already begun to make an impact. David's curiosity only grew from that point on. He started noticing other things, small details that painted a clearer picture of Anna. He saw the way the household staff seemed more at ease in her presence. He observed how she took care to keep things running smoothly behind the scenes, ensuring that events and social obligations were handled with a meticulous attention to detail. When they attended functions together, she engaged people in conversation not with shallow flattery, but with genuine interest. Even though she kept her veil firmly in place, it was impossible not to see that she held the room's attention. David found himself watching her, and not just to confirm his suspicions. He was, against his better judgment, impressed. Anna was intelligent, self-assured, and, above all, unshakably calm in the face of his coldness and society's gossip. The more he observed, the more he realized she didn't need his approval. She wasn't trying to win him over. She was simply being herself. There was a moment when David caught her tending to the garden. He had stepped outside to make a phone call, and there she was, crouched beside a row of rose bushes, carefully trimming the stems. The sunlight filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled light onto her veiled face. For a moment, he forgot his call and simply watched as she worked. She handled the flowers with the same precision he'd seen her apply to everything she did. Her hands were sure and steady, her movements deliberate. It struck him that she approached everything this way, calm, steady, and unwavering. She wasn't just maintaining the garden, she was cultivating something, tending to it with care and purpose. David's call went unanswered. He stood there a moment longer, then turned back inside, his mind racing. There was something about Anna that he hadn't been willing to see before. Something that didn't depend on appearances or surface-level judgments. For the first time since their wedding, David began to see that there was far more to her than the enigma of her concealed face. As the weeks continued to unfold, David's icy demeanor began to thaw, even if only slightly. He didn't go out of his way to speak to Anna, but he no longer avoided her. He allowed himself to acknowledge her presence in a way he hadn't before. When she entered a room, he watched her quietly. When she spoke, he listened. He didn't know what to call the feeling that was stirring inside him. It wasn't yet affection, but it was no longer disdain. It was something in between, something undefined but undeniable. And for Anna, though she didn't let it show, she noticed the subtle shift. David's temper flared less often. His comments, while still sharp at times, carried less venom. She could sense that his anger was no longer directed solely at her. It was as if he was starting to question himself, to grapple with his own preconceived notions and assumptions. For the first time, the balance of power in their marriage began to shift. Anna's patience and quiet determination had begun to chip away at David's arrogance. forcing him to confront a question he had never before considered. What if he had been wrong about her all along? What if the person he had written off so quickly was someone worth knowing? Someone worth understanding? Though he couldn't admit it. Not even to himself. David was beginning to realize that he wanted to find out. And that realization, more than anything else, marked the true start of their journey together. Session 4. The mask begins to slip. The days continued to pass in the Whitman household, bringing with them an unspoken shift between David and Anna. It was subtle at first, glances that lingered just a fraction longer than before. Moments of shared silence that felt less like distance and more like an unspoken understanding. David found himself growing increasingly aware of his wife's presence in ways that unsettled him. He was used to evaluating people, categorizing them based on their usefulness, their strengths, their weaknesses. But with Anna, the usual methods didn't apply. She had proven herself intelligent, capable, and maddeningly steadfast in her refusal to conform to his expectations. And yet, beneath his frustration, there was something else, a curiosity, a pull he couldn't quite explain. One evening, after another day of strategic meetings and tedious negotiations, David returned home earlier than usual. The house was quiet, save for the faint murmur of music drifting from the parlor. Drawn by the sound, he made his way toward the source. Pausing at the doorway, Anna sat at the grand piano, her posture straight, her hands moving effortlessly across the keys. The melody was unfamiliar, soft, melancholic, laced with something bittersweet. It was the first time David had seen her like this, lost in something entirely her own. He watched as her fingers glided over the ivory, her veil cascading down like a curtain of mystery, concealing her face even as the music seemed to bare her soul. There was something disarming about the sight. She had always carried herself with quiet control. But here, in this moment, she looked vulnerable. The realization hit him with an unexpected force. Before he could stop himself, he stepped into the room. The floor creaked beneath his polished shoes, breaking the spell. Anna's hands stilled, the final notes fading into silence. "You play," David said, his voice softer than he intended. Anna turned slightly, tilting her head as if studying him. "Sometimes," she admitted, "it helps me think." David leaned against the piano, watching her carefully. "I didn't take you for a musician." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "There are many things you don't know about me." The words were a challenge, one David wasn't sure he was ready to accept. But something in him stirred, an unwillingness to let the conversation end just yet. "So, tell me," he said, "what else don't I know?" Anna hesitated, her fingers brushing lightly against the keys. "I used to love the sea," she murmured. "When I was younger, my mother would take me to the coast. We'd walk along the cliffs at sunset, and she'd tell me that the ocean kept secrets." David raised a brow. "Secrets?" She said that the waves carried the stories of those who came before us. That if you listened closely, you could hear them whispering. It was an unexpected answer, poetic, almost wistful, not at all what he would have expected from the woman who had challenged him at every turn. David exhaled slowly. "And do you believe that?" Anna's gaze met his, her voice steady. "I believe that some things aren't meant to be understood right away. Sometimes, they need time to reveal themselves." The air between them shifted, thick with something unspoken. For the first time since their marriage began, David felt the weight of the walls he had built, not just around himself, but between them. He cleared his throat, breaking the moment. "Your mother sounds like she was a dreamer." Anna's expression softened. "She was." A beat of silence. Then, with deliberate patience, David reached out and rested his hand on the piano. Inches from hers. It wasn't quite a gesture of affection, but it wasn't indifference either. It was something in between. A step toward something unknown. Anna didn't pull away. She simply let the moment exist. And for the first time, David wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had been looking at this all wrong. Maybe Anna wasn't the one hiding. Maybe she was simply waiting for him to see what had been there all along. And that thought was terrifying. Session 5. Cracks in the armor. The tension between them was shifting. It wasn't just the lingering glances or the softened silences. It was something deeper. Something neither of them dared to name. David had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to shape them according to his will. But with Anna, that control slipped through his fingers like grains of sand. And nothing frustrated him more than the realization that, Despite his best efforts, she remained an enigma he couldn't unravel. The rumors about their marriage hadn't faded. If anything, they had intensified. Every day, new whispers slithered through the elite social circles, each one more invasive than the last. The longer Anna remained veiled, the more the public speculated. David overheard it at business meetings, at social gatherings, even within his own boardroom. A Whitman wedding shrouded in secrecy? Intriguing. Perhaps she's hiding something. It's a shame. Really, a man like David deserves a wife he can proudly introduce. He ignored them, at least outwardly, but inside, the words festered. So when an invitation arrived for the prestigious Harrington Charity Gala, an event attended by the city's most powerful figures, David saw an opportunity. This was his chance to reclaim control, to silence the gossip once and for all. "You're coming," he told Anna that morning, setting the invitation beside her teacup at breakfast. She picked it up, skimming the elegant gold lettering before lifting her gaze to meet his. "Is that a request or an order?" His jaw tightened. An expectation. Anna exhaled, setting the card back down. "And why, exactly, do you expect me to attend?" David's fingers curled around his coffee cup. "Because the whispers aren't going away. The longer you remain a mystery, the more people talk. This marriage, our marriage, is under a microscope." Her expression remained unreadable. "And you believe my presence at this gala will change that?" He leaned back, watching her carefully. "I think it will remind people that there's nothing to question." Anna studied him for a long moment before nodding. "Fine, I'll attend." Relief flickered through him, but it was short-lived. "But I won't be removing my veil," she added. The words landed like a blow, sharp and unexpected. David set his cup down with deliberate control. "Anna, you asked me to be there." "David," she interrupted, her voice calm but firm. "I agreed, but if you expect me to compromise who I am just to appease society, then perhaps you should reconsider why you wanted me there in the first place." She rose gracefully, leaving the invitation untouched on the table. David clenched his fists, his frustration simmering just beneath the surface. It wasn't just about the veil. It was about control, and for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he had any when it came to her. The night of the gala. The Harrington estate was a masterpiece of opulence. A sprawling mansion adorned with chandeliers that cast golden light over a sea of finely dressed guests. The air buzzed with the hum of conversation, the clinking of crystal glasses, and the occasional sound of laughter. David arrived first, shaking hands with old acquaintances, his polished charm firmly in place. But despite the smiles he gave and received, his mind was elsewhere. Then, she arrived. The moment Anna stepped into the ballroom, a ripple went through the crowd. Conversation stilled, eyes turned, and whispers ignited like sparks in dry air. She was breathtaking, dressed in an elegant midnight blue gown that shimmered with every movement. She carried herself with the same quiet grace that had both irritated and intrigued David from the beginning. The veil, still in place, cascaded down her shoulders, delicate yet defiant. But what stunned him most was the way she commanded the room without saying a single word. People whispered. Of course they did. But it wasn't all judgment. Some were fascinated, intrigued. Some, though they wouldn't dare admit it, envied the confidence it took to defy expectations so effortlessly. David watched as Anna navigated the social battlefield with effortless poise. She conversed with dignitaries and philanthropists, answering their thinly veiled inquiries with responses so smooth they left no room for further speculation. He had expected her to be questioned, to falter beneath the weight of scrutiny. But she did neither. If anything, she thrived under it. And for the first time, David wondered if he had severely underestimated her. The confrontation. The evening was progressing smoothly, until it wasn't. Toward the latter half of the gala, a woman approached them. Eleanor Ashford, a socialite with a talent for sniffing out scandal, smiled at them with saccharine sweetness. "Anna, dear," she crooned, her sharp eyes gleaming with interest. "Your presence tonight has caused quite a stir. But surely your husband has seen your face." "Yes?" Anna remained composed. "That depends on what he sees," she said evenly. Eleanor tilted her head. "Oh, how poetic. But really, darling, what are you hiding?" David felt the muscles in his jaw tighten. He turned to Eleanor, his voice smooth but laced with steel. "Nothing that concerns you." Eleanor's smirk didn't waver, but she recognized the warning in his tone. with a knowing glance between them. She lifted her glass in a silent toast before walking away. But the damage had been done. David and Anna stood in silence for a moment before he finally spoke. "Are you enjoying this?" Anna looked up at him, her expression unreadable. "Enjoying what?" "The mystery, the intrigue, the power you seem to hold over everyone, including me." Something flickered in her eyes. Something he couldn't quite name. "And if I am?" David exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. "Damn it, Anna, I don't know what you want from me." She regarded him for a long moment. "I want you to understand that there's more to me than what you see." "That's the problem," he said, his voice lower now. "I don't see you." Anna's gaze didn't waver. "Then maybe you should start looking." Her words hung between them, heavy and unrelenting. For the rest of the evening, David found himself watching her more closely, not just the veil, but everything else. The way she moved, the way she spoke, the way she held herself in a room full of people who desperately wanted to tear her apart. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted to see beneath the veil just to satisfy his own need for control, or because, for the first time in his life, he truly wanted to know someone. That thought unsettled him more than anything else. And as the night drew to a close, David Whitman found himself grappling with a realization he wasn't ready to face. Maybe Anna wasn't the one hiding. Maybe he was. Session 6. The first cracks in his walls. David Whitman had spent his entire life mastering control. Control over his emotions. Control over his empire. Control over every single variable that might stand between him and success. And yet, here he was, standing in the middle of the grand ballroom, watching his wife, a woman whose face he had never seen, command a room without lifting a finger. Anna had not wilted under scrutiny. She had not begged for acceptance. She had simply existed, and in doing so, she had shifted the power dynamic in a way that left David both furious and fascinated. He had expected her to be overwhelmed, perhaps even embarrassed by the whispers. He had assumed she would falter, that she would turn to him for protection. Instead, she had thrived, and worse, she had made him feel seen in a way he never had before. And David hated it. The drive home was silent, tension filling the space between them like an unspoken war. Anna sat composed in her seat, the glow of the passing city lights reflecting off the delicate fabric of her veil. She didn't fidget, she didn't glance his way. David, on the other hand, was gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Finally, unable to stomach the silence any longer, he spoke. "You enjoyed tonight, didn't you?" His voice was quieter than usual, but there was no mistaking the edge beneath it. Anna turned her head slightly, as if considering his question. "Did I?" David let out a dry, humorless laugh. "You tell me. You walked into that room knowing exactly what they'd say about you. And yet, you seemed completely unfazed." She tilted her head. "Would you have preferred if I was?" David clenched his jaw. He didn't know the answer. "I just don't understand you," he admitted, his voice lower now. "You don't react the way people are supposed to." Anna turned her body slightly toward him, her hands resting gently on her lap. "And how, exactly, am I supposed to react?" "Like a normal person," he snapped. "Like someone who gives a damn about what people think." The words hung between them, sharp and unyielding. Anna was silent for a moment before she spoke, her voice even. "David, I do care, but I don't let other people's opinions define me. I refuse to give them that power." David exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the wheel. "That's easy for you to say. You're not the one they're looking at." Anna turned back toward the window. "Aren't I?" Back at the estate, David was restless. After changing out of his tuxedo, he poured himself a glass of whiskey and stepped out onto the balcony. The city stretched out before him, a glittering maze of power and ambition. But for the first time, it felt small. Everything he had built, everything he had achieved, none of it gave him the same sense of clarity that Anna did. He heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. He didn't turn. Couldn't sleep? Anna's voice was soft. David exhaled, something like that. A pause. Then, "You're angry." David let out a short laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I'm not angry, Anna. I'm just tired." He turned slightly, finally facing her. "Do you know how exhausting it is to constantly be under a microscope? To have people analyze every move you make, every decision, every mistake?" Anna stepped closer, her hands resting lightly on the railing. "Yes, He frowned. Do you? She nodded. Maybe not in the way you do. But I know what it's like to be scrutinized. I know what it's like to be judged before people even bother to understand you. David studied her, his gaze searching. Then why do you make it worse? Why keep the veil? Why add to the mystery? Anna met his eyes. Because I want you to see me before you see me. David opened his mouth, then closed it again. He had no idea what to say to that. Anna turned, stepping back toward the house. Good night, David. And just like that, she was gone. David barely slept that night. He had built his entire life on the idea that people were predictable. That if you knew their weaknesses, their motivations, you could control the outcome. But Anna didn't fit into any of his calculations. She was neither weak nor seeking validation. She wasn't playing games, at least not in the way he understood them. And worst of all, she wasn't afraid of him. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. The next morning, David found himself watching Anna in the garden. She moved with the same quiet grace as always, her hands gently tending to the roses. Her posture relaxed. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting dappled patterns across the fabric of her veil. For the first time, David wondered what it would be like to reach out and lift it. Not out of frustration, not out of a desire to solve the puzzle she presented, but simply because he wanted to see her. The thought startled him. He turned away before she could notice. Heading back inside, that evening, a letter arrived. David was in his study, reviewing documents, when the butler delivered it. The handwriting on the envelope was unfamiliar. Frowning, he opened it. David, I'm sure by now you've heard the rumors. You've felt the weight of the whispers. But tell me, how well do you truly know your wife? Do you know where she was before this marriage? Do you know what she's hiding? Because I do. The blood drained from David's face. There was no signature, no name, just a single line at the bottom. Meet me tomorrow, midnight, St. Augustine's Chapel. David stared at the letter, his grip tightening. Whoever had sent this knew something he didn't. And for the first time since meeting Anna, a cold, unfamiliar feeling crept into his chest. Doubt. Session 7. Shadows of the Past. David couldn't focus on anything for the rest of the evening. The words from the anonymous letter burned in his mind, refusing to be ignored. Do you know where she was before this marriage? Do you know what she's hiding? Because I do. Every instinct in him screamed not to fall for the bait. He had spent years dealing with manipulation, rivals, competitors, the press. He knew how people played games, how they twisted truths to create leverage. But this was different. This wasn't about business. This was about her, Anna. David's grip tightened around the letter as he sat in his study, staring blankly at the flickering light of his desk lamp. No matter how much she frustrated him, no matter how much he told himself he didn't care, he did. He had spent months trying to understand her, trying to break past the barriers she kept so carefully in place. And now, someone was offering him answers. But what if he wasn't ready for them? A decision made. Midnight came faster than David anticipated. Dressed in a dark suit, he stepped out of the Whitman estate, his expression unreadable. His car was already waiting in the driveway, its engine purring softly against the silence of the night. He hadn't told Anna where he was going. For some reason, the thought unsettled him more than it should have. The streets were empty as he drove through the city, the night air thick with an eerie stillness. St. Augustine's Chapel stood at the edge of town, an old, abandoned relic from another time. The stained glass windows were cracked, the stone walls covered in ivy. David parked outside, his muscles tense as he stepped into the dimly lit structure. A lone candle flickered near the altar, casting long shadows across the worn pews. And then, a figure emerged from the darkness. A man, middle-aged, dressed in an expensive but slightly disheveled suit. His sharp eyes flickered with amusement as he studied David. David Whitman, the man drawled. I wasn't sure you'd come. David crossed his arms. I don't like being played with. Who the hell are you? The man smirked. Someone who knows more about your wife than you do. David's patience was razor thin. Then start talking. The man stepped closer, his smirk deepening. Do you know who Anna was before she became Anna Whitman? David didn't react, but the question landed like a punch to the gut. The man chuckled. You don't, do you? You married a woman you don't even know. He leaned in slightly. And that's dangerous. David's fists clenched. Get to the point. The man reached into his coat and pulled out a thin, worn envelope. Inside is everything you need to know. Where she was before you met her. What she left behind. David's eyes flickered to the envelope. His pulse pounded. You can thank me later, the man said, dropping the envelope onto one of the pews before turning away. Consider it a friendly warning. David didn't move. His gaze locked onto the small piece of paper as the stranger disappeared into the shadows. And then, silence. David exhaled slowly, then stepped forward, picking up the envelope. His fingers hesitated before opening it. Inside were photographs, documents, newspaper clippings, and as he sifted through them, his stomach twisted, because for the first time since meeting Anna, he realized that she had secrets. Real secrets. And now, he was holding them in his hands. Session 8. The Secret Unraveled. David sat in his study long after returning from St. Augustine's Chapel. The envelope resting on the polished mahogany desk in front of him. His fingers hovered over it, hesitating for the first time in his life. This was what he had wanted, wasn't it? Answers, clarity, the missing pieces to the puzzle that was Anna Whitman. And yet, now that he had them, something inside him told him that once he opened this envelope, there would be no going back. With a slow, measured breath, he picked up the first document. The past never dies. The first thing that caught his eye was a photograph. It was old, slightly worn at the edges, but there was no mistaking the woman in the image. Anna, only, she wasn't veiled. Her face, partially obscured by the shadow of a large hat, was turned away from the camera. The shot had been taken from a distance, as if whoever captured it hadn't wanted to be noticed. David's heart pounded in his chest as he flipped to the next paper. A birth certificate, but the name on it wasn't Anna Whitman. Elena Carlisle. David inhaled sharply. Anna, or Elena, had been someone else before this marriage. Before him, the next document was a police report. His fingers tightened around the paper as he scanned the text. There had been an incident. A fire. A murder investigation. David's pulse roared in his ears. The words blurred together, but the key details hit like a freight train. A wealthy family. A suspicious death. A case that was never solved. He flipped to another newspaper clipping. Heiress Elena Carlisle disappears following tragedy in the Carlisle estate. A cold chill ran down David's spine. Anna, no, Elena, wasn't just hiding her face. She was hiding an entire life. Confrontation. David didn't remember storming up the grand staircase of the Whitman estate. He didn't remember the sound of his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. But suddenly, he was outside Anna's bedroom door. He didn't knock. He pushed the door open, stepping inside without hesitation. Anna stood by the window, dressed in a silk robe, the soft glow of the moon casting shadows across the delicate fabric of her veil. She didn't startle at his entrance. She simply turned, as if she had been expecting this moment. David held up the envelope. You have 5 seconds to explain. His voice was calm, too calm, but the tension in his posture betrayed his restraint. Anna's hands tightened around the edge of the windowsill. You opened it. David let out a humorless laugh. What did you expect? You keep me in the dark for months. And then I find this? He threw the papers onto the table, the documents spilling out in a chaotic mess. Tell me, Anna, he caught himself, shaking his head. Or should I say, Elena? She didn't flinch. That name hasn't belonged to me in a long time. David's hands curled into fists. Why? What the hell happened to you? Anna hesitated, as if weighing how much to say. Then, with quiet resignation, she stepped forward. You've already read the reports, she said softly. You already know the story they told. I want your story. His voice was sharp, not the one the newspapers printed. Anna exhaled slowly. The fire, it wasn't an accident. David's breath hitched. My father had enemies. He built his empire on secrets, on power plays that made him untouchable for years. But he underestimated the cost of making enemies in our world. She swallowed. One night, someone came for him, for all of us. David's mind raced. Your father was murdered? Anna nodded. And my mother, too. The air between them was suffocating. David shook his head. Why wasn't this solved? Why wasn't someone held accountable? Because power protects the powerful. Anna whispered. The investigation was shut down. There were rumors, but no arrests, no convictions, just whispers in the dark. David's grip tightened on the edge of the table. And you? Anna met his gaze. I survived. Barely. A million questions swirled in David's head. but only one made it past his lips. Why hide? Anna's voice was quiet but firm. Because whoever did this was never caught. Because the moment I became Elena Carlisle again, I'd be hunted. David ran a hand through his hair. And you think marrying me keeps you safe? Something flickered in Anna's eyes. I think marrying you keeps me hidden. David let out a bitter laugh. So that's what this is? A damn disguise? Anna held his gaze. It was. His chest tightened. And now? Anna hesitated. Now. Her voice softened. Now. I don't know. That single sentence hit David harder than he expected. Because neither did he. He had wanted answers. Now he had them. But somehow, it only raised more questions. And for the first time, he wasn't sure if he wanted them answered. The choice, the weight of the revelation settled over them like an unspoken storm. David had two options. He could walk away, leave her to whatever ghost she was running from. He could demand an annulment, reclaim his control, erase the enigma of Anna Whitman from his life. Or, he could stay. He could stand beside her, fight the war she had been waging alone, and confront whatever shadows still lurked in her past. The problem was, he had no idea which choice was the right one. Anna took a slow step forward, her voice barely above a whisper. What now, David? He didn't answer. Because for the first time in his life, David Whitman didn't know what came next. Session 9. A War in the Shadows. David had spent his life calculating risks. Every move he made, whether in business, in negotiations, or in his personal life, was designed to give him the upper hand. Control was his greatest asset. But now, staring at Anna, Elena, he realized how completely out of control he was. She was no longer just a mystery to him. She was a woman with a past as dark and dangerous as his own. A woman who had been hunted, betrayed, and forced into hiding. And now, her past had come for her. For them, the morning after the revelation, David hadn't slept. He spent the night sitting in his study, the whiskey in his glass untouched, his mind replaying every moment since the start of their marriage. She had been running from something. He had felt it, suspected it, but he had assumed it was about pride or stubbornness. He had assumed it was him she was resisting, not them, not the people who had destroyed her family. At sunrise, he made a decision. She wasn't going to fight this war alone anymore. Breaking the silence, Anna found David in the garden, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored slacks, his posture tense. She stopped a few steps away, waiting. Finally, he turned. We need to talk. Anna nodded. I know. He studied her for a long moment before exhaling. I need to know everything. She hesitated, then sat down on the stone bench beside the roses she had so carefully tended. Where do you want me to start? David sat next to her. With them, the people who killed your parents. Anna's fingers curled around the fabric of her dress. I don't know their names. Not for certain, but I know what they were after. David's jaw tightened. And? She exhaled. My father, William Carlisle, was more than just an industrialist. He was involved in things, offshore accounts, hidden investments, political influence. He built an empire that made enemies. Powerful ones. David frowned. And he never told you? Anna's lips pressed together. Not everything, but I knew enough. She looked at him, enough to understand that when the fire happened, it wasn't an accident. David leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. You said they never found the killer. They didn't, Anna said, but I know someone who might have answers. David's gaze sharpened. Who? Anna hesitated. Then, my father's former advisor, Victor Langley. David sat up straighter. Langley? As in? Yes. She nodded. He disappeared after my family was killed. I thought he was dead. But recently, I've heard whispers that he's still alive. David's mind moved fast. If he's alive, he's in hiding for a reason. Anna's expression was unreadable, which means he knows something valuable. David let out a breath. And you want to find him? Anna met his eyes. Yes. A pause. Then David said the words he hadn't expected to say. Then we find him. Anna blinked. David, I'm not letting you do this alone. His voice was steady. I don't care what kind of danger this brings. I'm in this now. Something flickered in Anna's gaze. Something unreadable. Something unguarded. For the first time, she didn't try to argue. She simply nodded. And that was how the war began. A message in the dark. Later that evening, David made the first move. He had contacts, People who specialized in uncovering what wasn't meant to be found. He put out the word. If Victor Langley was alive, they would find him. But the first response wasn't what he expected. A note arrived at the Whitman estate, hand-delivered. No name, no return address. David opened it in the privacy of his study. Stop looking, or you'll regret it. No signature, no trace of who sent it. But the message was clear. They weren't the only ones searching for Langley. Someone else was watching, and they had just declared war. The choice that changed everything. David stared at the note for a long time before placing it in the fire, watching as the flames consumed it. When he turned, Anna was standing in the doorway. He didn't know how long she had been there, but the look on her face told him she already knew. They sent a warning, didn't they? She asked quietly. David's jaw tightened. Yes. Anna exhaled. We should stop. David crossed the room in 2 strides. You don't mean that. I do. No, you don't. He caught her wrist, his grip firm but not forceful. This isn't just about you anymore. Anna, you started running years ago. But this isn't just your fight now. Anna's throat bobbed. David, I won't let you get hurt because of me. He released her wrist, but his gaze didn't waver. You don't get to decide that. Silence. Then, what if we never find the truth? Anna's voice was barely above a whisper. What if it's too late? David stepped closer. Then we burn down every lie until we do. Anna's breath hitched. And for the first time, she realized David Whitman wasn't going to walk away. No matter how dangerous it became. No matter what they uncovered. They were in this together now. And nothing would ever be the same again. Session 10. A love worth fighting for. The storm had been building for weeks. Ever since David had discovered Anna's real identity. Their marriage had shifted into something neither of them fully understood. No longer just a business arrangement. No longer just a battle of wills. It had become something deeper. Something dangerous. They had spent the last few days chasing leads. Uncovering pieces of a puzzle that had remained unsolved for years. The more they dug, the more enemies surfaced. And now, as David stood in the study of their estate, the weight of everything they had learned pressed down on him like a vice. Victor Langley had been found. But he wasn't alone. The meeting that changed everything. David pulled the sleek black car up to an abandoned warehouse at the edge of the city. The place was a relic of the past, steel beams rusting. Windows shattered. The kind of place where secrets were buried and never meant to be uncovered. Anna sat beside him, her fingers curled into the fabric of her dress. Her veil, for once, had been removed. She wasn't hiding anymore. You don't have to do this, David said quietly. Anna turned to him, her expression unreadable. Yes, I do. David exhaled sharply. He didn't like this. Not the secrecy. Not the risk. But more than anything, he didn't like the idea of her walking into danger without knowing what waited for them on the other side. He reached out, taking her hand. No matter what happens in there, you stay close to me. Anna's lips parted slightly, surprise flickering in her eyes. She nodded. Together, they stepped out of the car. Inside, Victor Langley was already waiting. The man was older now. His face lined with age and something darker, regret. Maybe. He looked up as they entered, his gaze locking onto Anna. Elena Carlisle, he murmured, shaking his head. I never thought I'd see you again. Anna's spine straightened. You left, she said. You disappeared the night my family was murdered. Victor's eyes darkened. Because I would have been next. David crossed his arms. Who were they? His voice was cold, sharp. The ones who did this. Victor hesitated. Then, slowly, he reached into his coat and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. This is what they were after, he said, handing it to Anna. She unfolded it carefully. David stepped closer, his eyes scanning the contents. It was a contract, a financial agreement signed by William Carlisle himself. But it wasn't just any contract. It was a blackmail ledger. David's stomach twisted. He had seen deals like this before, agreements made in the shadows. Where money was power and silence was currency. Anna's father had been part of something much bigger than they had realized. And someone had killed him to keep it buried. The threat revealed. Before either of them could react, a sudden noise echoed through the warehouse. Footsteps. David's muscles tensed. Anna turned, eyes widening. They're here. The door burst open. 4 men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence radiating authority. But it was the man in the center who drew David's attention. Charles Montgomery. David's blood ran cold. Montgomery was one of the most powerful men in the country, old money. Political connections. A man who never got his hands dirty because he had others to do it for him. He smiled. Well, what an interesting reunion. Anna's breath hitched. You, she whispered. Montgomery stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over them like they were nothing more than pieces on a chessboard. I warned you to stop looking, he said. You should have listened. David stepped in front of Anna. His jaw clenched. You killed her parents. Montgomery chuckled. Me? No, but I made sure the right people did. He tilted his head. And now, it seems I'll have to clean up another mess. Anna's hands balled into fists. Why? Her voice was hoarse. Why go this far? Montgomery sighed. Because your father was a liability. He thought he could play the game without paying the price. And now, you're making the same mistake. David's body coiled with tension. He could feel the danger in the air, the weight of an inevitable choice pressing down on him. Montgomery turned to him. You, of all people, should understand, Whitman. Power requires sacrifice. You've played in these circles long enough to know that. David's jaw tightened. The difference between you and me, Montgomery, is that I know when to walk away. Montgomery smirked. Do you? His eyes flicked toward Anna. David moved before he could think. His fist connected with Montgomery's jaw, sending the older man stumbling backward. The guards reacted instantly, reaching for their weapons. Anna gasped. David. Chaos erupted. Victor lunged for one of the men, knocking a gun from his grip. David threw another punch, dodging a blow to his ribs. Anna grabbed a metal pipe from the floor, swinging it with surprising precision. But they were outnumbered. Montgomery staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his lip. Enough, he barked. Stand down. The guards hesitated, then backed away. Montgomery's eyes burned with fury. You've made a mistake, Whitman. David straightened, breathing heavily. No, his voice was firm. You did. Montgomery's lips curled. You have no idea what you've just started. David turned to Anna. We're leaving. She nodded, her breathing unsteady. Victor moved toward them. They won't let this go. David's expression was hard. Neither will I. Montgomery watched them, his gaze cold. You can run, Whitman. His smirk returned. But the war has just begun. The aftermath. The drive home was silent. David's hands gripped the wheel, his mind racing. Anna sat beside him, staring out the window. Her entire life had been built on a lie. And now, she had the proof she had been searching for. But at what cost? David exhaled slowly. This wasn't over. Montgomery had power, but so did he. And for the first time in his life, David knew exactly what he was willing to fight for. He glanced at Anna. She turned to him, her eyes searching his. And for the first time, she didn't look afraid. She looked like a woman ready to fight. David reached over, taking her hand. We end this, he said. Anna nodded. Together. And as the city lights flickered in the distance, David Whitman knew one thing for certain. He had just fallen in love with the most dangerous woman he had ever met. A love worth fighting for. The battle had only just begun. David and Anna had spent months tangled in a marriage of convenience. A war of wills that neither had been prepared for. But now, everything had changed. Now, they were no longer just two strangers bound by obligation. Now, they were two people fighting for the truth. Fighting for each other. The last move. David had always known that power came with a cost. But standing in the private meeting room of Whitman Enterprises, he realized that for the first time in his life, he was willing to pay it. Across from him, Charles Montgomery sat with his usual air of arrogance. A man who had built his empire on the belief that he was untouchable. But David had learned something about men like him. They weren't invincible. They only seemed that way until someone dared to stand against them. You've made a mistake, Montgomery said smoothly, swirling the whiskey in his glass. This isn't a fight you can win. David leaned forward, his expression unreadable. You think I don't know that? His voice was calm, lethal. You think I haven't spent my entire life knowing that men like you always have the upper hand? Montgomery smirked. Then you understand why you should walk away. David tilted his head. No, I understand why you should. Montgomery's smirk faltered. David tossed a folder onto the table between them. Montgomery hesitated before flipping it open. The moment his eyes scanned the contents, his expression darkened. Financial records, offshore accounts, bribes. David listed off, his tone casual. I have enough evidence to bury you. Montgomery. Montgomery's jaw tightened. You think this is enough to take me down? David leaned back, crossing his arms. No, but it's enough to make you lose your reputation, your business, your power. Montgomery exhaled sharply, his gaze flickering to the door, as if weighing his options. But David wasn't done. I don't need to destroy you, Montgomery, he continued, his voice dropping lower. I just need to make you irrelevant. Silence. Then, Montgomery's fingers curled around the folder. What do you want? David smiled coldly. Disappear. Stay out of our lives. And never come near Anna again. Montgomery's nostrils flared. And if I don't? David's expression turned to steel. Then I burn everything you've ever built to the ground. A long, tense moment passed. Then Montgomery's lips pressed into a thin line. You think you've won, Whitman, he said quietly. But this isn't over. David stood. It is for you. He turned and walked away, leaving Montgomery alone with the weight of his own downfall. And for the first time since this war had begun, David felt something close to peace. The final reveal. Anna was waiting for him at the estate. She stood by the window, the last rays of the setting sun casting a golden glow around her. The veil was gone. She turned as he entered, her expression unreadable. It's done? David nodded. It's done. A long silence stretched between them. Then, you never asked, she murmured. David frowned. Asked what? Her gaze met his. If I ever planned to take off the veil. David exhaled slowly, stepping toward her. I realized it wasn't my choice to make. Anna studied him, searching for something. And now? David reached out, his fingers grazing her jaw with the lightest touch. Now, I don't need to see your face to know who you are. Anna's breath hitched. Then, with deliberate slowness, she lifted her hands and removed the last barrier between them. David's heart clenched as he looked at her, truly looked at her. For the first time, she was beautiful, but that wasn't what made him fall in love with her. It was the fire in her eyes, the quiet strength in the way she carried herself. The woman she had been all along, veil or no veil. Anna swallowed hard. Say something. David cupped her face gently, his thumb tracing the curve of her cheek. I see you, he whispered. A shuddering breath left her lips. And then, she kissed him. Not a kiss of obligation. Not a kiss of duty. A kiss of choice. Of love. Of everything they had fought for. And as David pulled her closer, he knew they had won. Not just the war against Montgomery. Not just the war against the past. But the war within themselves. And for the first time, their marriage wasn't built on power. Or secrecy. Or survival. It was built on something far stronger. It was built on love. The beginning of forever. Months later, they stood together on the balcony of their private villa, the ocean stretching endlessly before them. Anna leaned against him, her fingers intertwined with his. So what happens now? David pressed a kiss to her temple. Whatever we want. Anna smiled. And if the past comes back for us? David's grip tightened around her waist. Then we fight. Together. She turned to him, her eyes shining. Together, she whispered. And as the waves crashed against the shore, as the world faded into the background, David Whitman knew this was where he was meant to be. With her. Forever. If this story has touched your heart, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Millionaire Love Stories. Have love and resilience ever changed your life? Let us know in the comments. We'd love to hear your story. Subscribe for more stories of love, transformation, and the power of connection. Together, let's believe in the magic of love.